That's amazing. Thank you very much. So as Mike said, I'm Darren Bessette. I'm going to start my presentation very shortly. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what it is that happens when you have photons hit a sensor and how that actually gets converted into what you see on a computer screen. And I'm really going to break it down into four main categories. We're going to talk about what exactly is that sensor that's in your camera, your phone, whatever. How does that actually work? How does it take the light and convert it into something that we can actually see on a screen? What are all the work that has to be done, all the intelligence, all the technologies that are involved with getting that information out of the sensor and onto a screen? I'm also going to talk about pixel architecture. So the pixel is actually that little element that sees the light. So how is that created, and what is it composed of, and how does it work, and why are some pixels better than others, and why are some sensors better than others? And then I'm going to talk about a few things like noise, color, and image artifacts, some of those things that get introduced into images that some cases you're able to correct and compensate. Other times you may be inherent to it that you'll have to kind of not be able to do anything. You'll have to work to try to get rid of it, whether it's within the electronics, within the software, or maybe you have to take it externally into like a Photoshop and actually do that manual editing, which we always want to try to avoid. We want to make sure we get as clean of an image out of the sensor as possible. And then I'm going to talk about file formats and why that is important, because depending on the file format you choose to save your image could introduce other artifacts to the image that you didn't realize were actually going to happen. So understanding how the file format works and how images are saved to a file, whether it's on your computer or on your camera, will also help you ensure that you get the best quality image all the way through that whole process of capturing it and saving it and then reproducing it onto a medium, whether it's a screen or whether it's a print media. So kind of already talked about this, but this is my slide I do for work, so I'm just going to quickly talk about myself. So I'm a product marketing manager for a company here in Ottawa. We actually sell Sony sensors. Sony probably owns about 50% of the global sensor market of all the sensors in the world. That includes mobile phones and the industrial stuff that I work on. So I'm very familiar with their sensors, and of course I'm a little bit biased because I work with them. I also have one of their cameras. I'm probably one of the few that uses a Sony camera, but I understand the technology, so I appreciate it. I've been in this machine vision environment for over 20 years. I'm a certified professional. I'm a very amateur photographer, which is why I'm part of this meetup. I'm hoping to learn more from you on how to actually create stunning photographs. I know how to make them look professional and accurate. I just don't know that whole creative side, which is what I'm hoping to work on a bit more. So with that, let's talk about what an image sensor is. So there are several different aspects to a sensor. All sensors start with a piece of silicon, and that silicon is actually doped, meaning that they introduce elements into the silicon structure to create these pockets of different materials. And those materials actually act as a way of creating positive and negative areas within the sensor. And that's essentially how a transistor is created. It's essentially an area that is doped with an atom that has more electrons, so it's more negatively charged, that is wrapped around an area that is doped with a positively charged area. And those two areas create an electrical boundary that keeps things within themselves, unless there's enough energy to force something to cross that boundary. And that's essentially how a sensor works. And the nice thing about silicon is that it actually aligns very well with how people see. The whole purpose of the sensor itself is to convert photons into electrons so they can be measured. So this piece of silicon is able to capture and hold the photons coming in and be able to store that. So there's two types of sensors that you may still see in the world. CCDs was kind of the first digital style sensor that's been out there. It was used in the very early digital cameras, and in some cases you may still see a few of them talking about it now. But I'd say in the last 5 to 10 years, everything has gone more towards a CMOS-based sensor. And I'm going to explain the differences between the two in the next couple of slides, but essentially the CCDs have always produced one of the best image quality that you can get. The challenge though with it is that's very hard to build because of how you need to do it, all the things you need to build around it in order to get it to work properly. It's very high quality. It produces an excellent response. It's able to convert photons very well, and you're able to really control the noise that gets introduced into it. And you have control over how well the analog side of things, so those electrons and those voltages, get converted into a digital domain, so into digital numbers. And because of that, you have a lot of flexibility in how you design the camera to be able to maximize depending on how your application is, whether you have a specific application targeting a specific field or need specific requirements. You can do different things to help improve the quality. And I'll go into that a little bit later when I talk about noise. The challenge with CCD, though, is that it's very difficult to implement. You really need to be a very specialized hardware engineer in analog circuitry to understand the nuances of connecting these pieces together. There's a lot of different things that you have to be aware of, and even the slightest mistake can introduce artifacts or noise into the image that can take you a really long time to decipher. So you have to have a lot of experience to be able to catch these in advance during the design phase. Otherwise, you're wasting a lot of money redoing your designs over and over again until you can clean it up. The wonderful thing about CMOS is that they've now been able to put everything onto one chip. So all these external componentries that used to have in the past with CCDs can now all be jammed into one neat package. And therefore, you're able to get more compact designs, and they're able to do a lot more on the sensor itself. And in the last 5 years, the quality of these CMOS sensors has dramatically improved. Back in the days when I first started seeing the CMOS sensor, they were noisy as crazy. Like all you saw was noise. There's nothing you could do to really get rid of that. However, with all these advancements really in the last 5 to 10 years, it's amazing. And now these sensors rival and sometimes are even better than the equivalent CCDs. At the below here, I kind of have a little spectral graph. It essentially shows the response curve of either one of these sensors. So if I was to shine light that is between, we'll say 400 nanometers, which is that purpley UV bluish range, all the way into the longer wavelengths, which is the red, so around the 650, 700, this is where the human eye really can see, is in that visible range where they see the colors. The reason why we've chosen these style of sensors is that they very closely resemble the response to the human eye. And that was key to choosing this type of technology, these types of materials. So with CCD, you can see that it's actually more sensitive in the near IR range, which for machine vision, we use that a lot because there's a lot of things we can do, especially when we're talking about security cameras where you want to have it working in the dark so people don't see that the camera's on, but you want to be able to shine light without actually having light on. So you can use near IR light and people don't see it and still have a really illuminated scene. CMOS is actually a little bit more closely to, or sorry, I should say, it patterns more closely to the human eye, which is why CMOS is gaining more and more traction with uses and becoming better quality and aligning better with a lot of the high quality images you're now seeing. So what does a CCD sensor really look like? If you were to take a microscope and zoom into a sensor, this is essentially what it would look like. You have this array of pixels, and on the pixels, there's a whole whack of different things going on. There's a micro lens that's on it that's actually steering the photons to get into the sweet spot of the pixel, and there's these little color filters that are on it. It's called the Bayer mask. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about why that's there later on, but essentially that's how the sensor sees color. And then on top of that, there's just a little bit of electronics around the edge to be able to control the sensor and be able to take the data off the sensor and bring it into an external device where it'll get digitized and passed along through the system. So what you have is these rows and columns of pixels, and as the pixels accumulate light, they get stored within the pixel well, and eventually when you want to read it out, that pixel is then shifted through the entire pixel array into this thing called a horizontal shift register, which then gets shifted out at a higher frequency through an amplifier, where it then goes into an external circuit to get digitized and converted into ones and zeros. On a CMOS, very similar to what you see here, but now you have a lot more electronics around the edge. Because of the nature of the silicon, we're able to do a lot more than just sensor arrays versus CCD, which really is purpose-built for capturing light. We now are able to use the sensor and provide a lot more components to it and be able to do a lot more functions within it. So again, you still have this pixel array. And one thing to keep in mind is that this image is actually, this bottom row is actually the top of the image, because keep in mind that when you have a lens, the lens actually projects the image inverted. And so therefore, typically the sensor will read the image backwards. So it's actually reading from the bottom up. So this is the top, that's the bottom, as confusing as that sounds. It too has that same Bayer mask on it, has those same micro lenses to help guide it. The big thing with CMOS, though, is that the area that is sensitive to light is actually much smaller, because there's a little bit of discrete electronics around the pixel to help control the functionality of that pixel and to be able to take the data out. So it is less sensitive because of that. It doesn't have the same what we call fill factor. Typically with a CCD, the fill factor for each pixel is in the high 80s, maybe even the high 90s. With CMOS, some of the earlier ones, I can't say that so much now, but in the back in the days, you're looking at fill factors of between 30 and 40% of the area devoted to that pixel. So when you're looking at the entire sensor array, that's a lot of photons that may be not being directed to the proper area where they're going to be read properly, which is part of the reason why CMOS sensors had the nomenclature of being less sensitive and less perfect when compared to CCDs. Now that's being changed a lot lately with some of the new technologies, which I'll go into a lot more detail later. But in essence, CMOS is starting to get better and starting to be able to rival a lot of these CCDs. So how it works is it able to capture the photons, again, within the pixel array, and then it has the amplifier built within it, and then it gets clocked through and then goes through what they call correlated double sampling, or CDS. And what that is a method of being able to minimize how much noise gets introduced into the chain. When you're reading these pixels, the mere fact of reading it can actually introduce noise into that pixel. It's kind of this weird quantum theory, technical jargon. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now, but the fact that you're probing the pixel to be able to understand how many electrons it has, so what its charge is, you can essentially introduce charge. So you can introduce noise into the pixel by the sheer fact you're reading it. So this correlated double sampling helps minimize, it samples the pixel in two different ways and then compares the two and then decides what the differences are and tries to minimize that difference. Then it gets digitized, and so at that point, at least it stops all the analog noise from getting in. And then you do another correlated double sampling in the digital domain to again further reduce any noise that's introduced. Once that pixel is digitized, then there's less chance of introducing noise that could be apparent around the sensor that could get introduced into that. When you're talking about sensors, you're often talking about resolutions. And I just kind of want to show this chart here to kind of give you a sample of the various different resolutions that these sensors can come in. So for those of you who have digital cameras, you're probably looking in the range of this area here. So your typical 35 millimeter sensor versus the resolution of, let's say, an APS sensor. You also have, in some cases, maybe you have a 4/3 sensor. You could have your Canon or your Sigma. All these will fall into this range. I also deal with a lot of more of the industrialized ones where we start talking about this smaller stuff. So this smaller stuff here, often you'll find in more compact cameras. It's probably the same ones you would see in your cell phones. Your cell phones actually start going into the smaller range, which is in this 1/3 inch area. Or you can have these humongous sensors like this one here, which is like a 39 megapixel camera that has these humongous pixels that is a CCD based, very sensitive, very accurate, which is often put into the telescopes that go into the Hubble telescope. So those big military grade style sensors actually fall into these larger resolutions. The key thing to keep in mind when it comes to resolution and optical formats is the optical format, when we talk about an inch or 2/3 inch or larger, actually relates to the old days when you used to have tube cameras. So the tube itself was fairly large and the sensor was inside that tube. And so a 1-inch tube corresponded to a particular size of image. When sensors became digitized, the equivalent size of sensor for that 1-inch tube happened to be much smaller. So when you actually measure the corner to corner area or diagonal of a sensor, it's not actually 1 inch. It's actually less. I don't know the exact difference between the two, but I think it's like somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the actual size. So you often hear people talking about, well, I have a 1-inch lens, I need to match it to a 1-inch sensor. The actual sensor itself is not that size, it's much smaller, but it's just old nomenclature that's been carried forward from the old analog days. So now I'm going to talk about how photons get captured into electrons. So you have this thing called a pixel. Here's an individual pixel. Inside that pixel, it has a photosensitive area that is able to trap photons coming in and convert it to electrons. So as the photon energy comes in, it creates these electrons. As you see, the light comes in, bang, it creates an electron as it captures. The longer the wavelength is, so like in the near infrared, the deeper it will penetrate into that photon layer and get captured, versus the smaller ones like the blues and the purples will actually go barely penetrate into that surface and get captured. So when you're looking at that, again, my little pixel here, sorry, my animations aren't great. So you got these red ones, they go deep, deep, deep. And in some cases, if it's in near IR, can actually pass right through and not get detected by the sensor. So in some cases, you need to make that pixel well deeper in order to trap those longer photons. The other problem you might have is that UV will actually get reflected off the surface. So either it's the glass or the top of the silicon will actually have these UV rays get caught before they even get a chance to get in and reflect it off because of the material that's on that surface. So therefore, you need to be aware and you need to match your sensor in order to trap whichever wavelength you're trying to catch. Now, for our situations, we're only looking at the visible light, so we don't care so much about the near IR or the IR light, and we don't care about the UV. Both those will have a negative influence on our images, so we don't care. But if there are situations where you're looking to capture these, then you need to go to a different style of process to develop the sensor using different materials that are more sensitive to those regions. Now we'll talk about what the pixel architecture looks like. So as I mentioned, each pixel has these micro lenses on top of it. And the reason why we have these micro lenses is that there's actually these electronics. So I talked about briefly about the fill factor. So this blue area is actually the sensitive part that wants to capture all those photons and convert them to electrons. However, if a photon hits this area on the outside, it'll actually get reflected off or absorbed in an area where it's not going to be detected. So the micro lens's job is actually to steer the light into the photosensitive area of the pixel so that it's properly detected. The drawback to these, and I'll go into it a little bit later, is that these micro lenses, if the light is coming in at a really hard angle, could actually steer that into the wrong area. Worst case, it could even go into the wrong color pixel if there is a color filter. So if you have this color filter between the micro lens and the pixel array, the green light would be allowed to pass through, the blue and red would get reflected off. However, if it's coming at a really hard angle, it'll get through the green filter and get detected by what should be either a blue or red pixel, which is something you're trying to avoid. So you want to try to maximize the area that's photosensitive and minimize how much you need to apply the lens to the top of it to ensure more accurate response. There are two styles of pixels that have been created. The first one was what they call a frontside illuminated sensor. And it's kind of a weird name when you think about it, because what I mean by a frontside illuminated pixel is that the pixel well is actually at the bottom. So the light's got to go through the micro lens, through the filter, pass all this metal wiring, and then finally get into where the pixel is. And it wasn't originally called frontside illuminated, it was just called a sensor. But when they discovered that they could flip it upside down and bring that pixel well to the top, it's like if we were shining light from the bottom of it, which is why they came up with this term of backside illuminated. And then of course they had to create a term for frontside illuminated. So original CMOS sensors were frontside illuminated. Like I said, if you had light that was coming in at a really hard angle, it would pass through this blue filter, may get bounced around through the metal, and then actually gravitate into this green area, which would get detected as a green pixel when it should be a blue pixel. So this is why this architecture is becoming less and less desired. It is still a good architecture, but it limits how big we can make these, or how small we can make these pixels, and how big we can make the actual sensor. By flipping it around, the chances of us having light going into the wrong well has been greatly reduced, because now the photons will gather into their right locations because they don't have far to go. And also, we don't have all this metal in the way that can reflect light in other directions or even completely out of the sensor. And now, also with this, now that we have this on the bottom side, we can actually stack the sensors and put more things underneath. So we can put more circuitry underneath to make these sensors even more powerful and allow them to do a lot more, where you would need multiple chips to do that. The other thing that you may have seen, and this is one of these slides I'd love to show, there's two different types of what they call electronic shutters. So when you're talking about a digital still camera, typically you have a mechanical shutter that avoids these issues completely. However, in some cases, especially with some of the mirrorless cameras, they're actually doing away with that mechanical shutter and using solely the electronic shutter that's built into the sensor. There are two types of shutters that are designed into a sensor, and each one has its pros and cons. The more common one, the cheaper one, the easiest one to make is what they call the rolling shutter. And the rolling shutter, essentially, you can think of it as if it's a curtain that's being drawn across the sensor. So as I want to start my exposure, I pull open the curtain starting from the top of the sensor, and I pull it down and I let each row start exposing. Once I've reached my exposure time, I start closing that window, and I just have this band of exposure that's strolling across the sensor that defines how much light each row will get. Now, each row will get the exact same amount of light. However, the point at which each one starts and ends is at a different time within the time spectrum. So for normal operations, it's not a big deal. However, when you're trying to image fast-moving objects like this fan blade, you get these really cool and funky effects, which are sometimes undesirable. So if you can imagine, this is a fan blade that's spinning around, and because of the way the sensor was running, you get these weird warping of the image. And oftentimes you see that when people are taking pictures outside of a plane that has a prop for an engine. Excuse me. And so you get this really weird effect depending on how fast things are moving and how long the exposure is. But then what they've done is they've been able to create a global shutter, which acts very much like a mechanical shutter. So it's able to start the exposure of all the sensor array at the exact same time and stop it at the exact same time. So you're able to do a much better job at stopping the motion that's happening on the sensor.
So, Darren.
Yeah.
So some of the newer digital cameras, Sony, Nikon, etc., have a ability to actually get into electronic shutter or turn it on and off type of thing. So I guess they're doing a hybrid type of thing.
Yes. Yeah, and the reason for that is that the mechanical shutter still takes some time to open and close. However, it is a much better oftentimes at stopping the light in between frames. So one of the challenges with the electronic shutter is that it's not fully opaque. If the light is very, very bright, it can still seep through that electronic shutter and start accumulating. So you get this almost like this noise in the background because the light is so bright. So especially if you're looking at the sun, the electronic shutter is not good enough to block out that intense light from going inside. And in some cases, especially with CCDs, it would actually burn into the sensor and create these artifacts that were permanently ingrained into the sensor structure.
Interesting, because it's one of the things you can do with some of the modern cameras, and I kind of asked myself, why should I use electronic or mechanical? The other one had to do with flicker reduction for neon light.
Yep. Yeah, so the thing with rolling shutter, the way you'll see flicker with rolling shutter is you'll see it as a band that goes across the image, versus with a global shutter, it'd be a hum, like if the image will slowly increase and decrease with temperature. And a lot of that is defined by the exposure value and the flickering of light. So oftentimes we tell people that when you have a specific frequency of light, you want to kind of match that exposure time to be aligned with that flicker. So you're always catching the cycle of the light at the exact same time, or you run it for a long period of time so you get the full cycle of that light. So it's really only an issue when it's a short exposure. So typically we're talking like a 60 hertz light is what you used to see a lot of. So if you ran your sensor at 1 over a 60th of a second, which is about 16 milliseconds, then you would see the full cycle of light. Excuse me, I'm having a hard time talking. You'd see that full cycle of light. But if you went lower than that, then you would catch the differences in the light. And sometimes it could be brighter, sometimes it could be darker, depending on when it was. So that's when you start trying to align your timing to that frequency so that you minimize those effects. All right, sorry about that. So now that you have the data, I'll say, the electrons in there, you want to digitize it. There's several different methods for digitizing, and the bit depth of that digitization has a strong influence in the quality of the data that's output. So if everyone hopefully remembers some of their math and the way in which the scales work, the bits that I have is defines how many intensity levels I have. So if I have a 2-bit value, it means I have values that can go from 0, 1, 2, and 3. Those are my 2 bits, which represents 4 values, and therefore I can see white, light gray, a dark gray, and a black. However, the more bits I use to represent that data, the more granular I can get those intensities. And the more granularity I get it, the less you see the differences between them. And it gets to a point where it almost seems like they're seamless and there's really no granularity. They just flow from one to another. For when it comes to intensity values, the human eye is able to see about an 8-bit, so like a 256 different shades of gray. And after that, they don't really perceive the differences that well. They know there is a gradient, but they can't see the hard gradient, the true differences between them. So that's why many of the cameras will stop around this 8-bit range. However, when you go into the 10-bit range, you get a lot more granularity. And oftentimes, if you're going to be doing some post-processing to the image, putting the image into that 10-bit ensures that you have a lot of data there that if ever there is some artifacts that get introduced because of the way the algorithms and the functions are being applied to the camera, they may not be seen as easily when you have more bits of data. They'll get lost in that noise, and then when you then reduce it back to a typical image of 8 bits, then that noise stays into the area where you're throwing away, and then you get a really nice clean image after the fact. The interesting thing, though, is even though the human eye can only see about 8 bits of gray, it can see over 4 million different shades of color. So because of the way the eye works, it's pretty phenomenal. And obviously, if you're not colorblind, you'll be able to see that many shades. But if you are, you'll see obviously a lot less. But it's interesting that we're better able to see differences in color than we are able to see differences in light intensity. And for that reason, the sensors have been designed to maximize and reproduce what the human eye can see. So when we talk about the output, every sensor that is produced nowadays typically produces a monochrome image. The pixels themselves don't really see color. The way we get color is by putting these filters, and we put this thing called a Bayer mask. That's the more common term. There's different other styles of masks, but typically we use a Bayer mask. And a Bayer mask is a combination of filters that uses green, blue, and red. And it's usually in this combination here, where you have a full row of blue and green and a full row of green and red. And they'll oscillate all the way through, and the greens will always be opposite each other. And the reason for that is severalfold. The human eye really sees green. They're attracted to green, and so therefore we need to have more green in the image in order to not only get the color information, but also to get that intensity information. So green is used to not only provide color, but also provide an overall intensity for the entire image. So then you have the red and the blue that provides the color, so that the additional information to be able to distinguish whether it's a red-orange, or maybe it's a blue-green, or those wonderful shades in between all those colors. And they're mapped on top of this photodiode, which I've already talked about, how you have the photosensitive area and all the transistors. And what's really nice is that, like I said, the silicon itself has a similar response curve to the human eye. And as a result, when you look at it, you see this spectral response that the sensor provides in a monochrome domain, which basically rises as that green area, because it's actually more sensitive to the green, even though there's more green pixels. It's irrelevant of that. But once you put a green filter on, well, then now you can really separate out the green channel from the blue and the red. The challenge, though, as you can see probably pretty quickly by looking at this, is that that blue pixel will actually see some of the green light. And that red pixel will also see some of that green light, just like the green will see some of the red and possibly some of that blue. So even though you have these filters on it, you still need to be able to tweak the colors in order to get more precise colors. And I'll talk about that later, when some of the techniques you use to get more accurate color. The other drawback to this is that once you start going up to the longer frequencies around here, where it starts going to the near IR, so the 700 nanometer up until the 1200 nanometer, all 3 pixels have an equal response, meaning that the filter no longer does its job. It's not able to block out that light anymore, and all 3 will respond to that light in the IR range. So next thing we talk about is the dynamic range and black level. So when I talk about dynamic range, what I'm talking about is what is the signal to noise ratio that the sensor is able to output. And that's, once you factor in the typical noise floor and the maximum value of the signal that the sensor can produce, that is overall dynamic range. And it's usually defined in a dB format, so it's 20 log of the number at saturation divided by the number of the noise, and that gives you a dynamic range. For most sensors nowadays, you're looking between about 40 to 60 dB, which is representative of about 6 to 7 bits of physical information in an 8-bit data set of a picture. So that's why when you start using 10 bits, you're able to get better response if you're able to get that noise floor even lower, and you'll be able to get more signal out and then get truer images. The other thing that's talked about a lot is the black level. So the black level defines essentially what's the lowest possible signal that represents 0 before I start seeing signals increasing from there. And the way that is determined is that there's actually black pixels, so pixels that are not allowed to see light, and that sets the baseline. So it reacts the same way as all the other pixels do, except for they don't get exposed to light. So all the noise that accumulates within a typical sensor, whether it's the heat that creates electrons that get trapped by the by the pixels, or other contributors, that lowest possible charge detected in those pixels defines the lowest value, or that 0 value in digital numbers in the digital domain. And then from there, all the other pixels get measured against that. So if their value is a certain percentage above 0, then that number gets digitized and converted into a number that we see in the image. What else is there? Yeah, so I talked about all that.
So okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is the right slide or not. I know some of our cameras have a long exposure noise reduction where the camera seems to take 2 pictures, one real one and then one black one to somehow subtract the noise. I don't know if that has to do with your dark pixels or that's another process.
That's actually another process. Now we'll get back to that later.
Okay.
That is a way of doing what they call high dynamic range. What they do is they take the 2 images, and for those areas where they get exposed really quickly because it's really bright, you take a short exposure for that to capture that information. And then you take a really long exposure to get those really dark areas. And then you merge the 2 images together, thereby making the dynamic range appear to be much larger than what it actually is. It's not a straight line curve, it's more of an artificial curve, but as a result, you're able to get a lot more information in the bright areas and the dark areas within one image. So, talking about noise, there are 4 primary sources of noise that are seen within sensors. There are obviously other ones as well, but these are the ones that are more typical of what you'd see. So there's this thing called read noise, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. So the process of being able to measure the amount of charge within the pixel well and carry it through and digitize it and read what that value is, has the chances of introducing noise within it, within that pixel value. And typically it's a low order, we're talking 8 to 10 electrons out of a possible 1,000 to tens of thousands of electrons that are capable of being stored within a pixel. However, it's something that's always there. It's consistent. If you use the same method to read the pixel, that read noise is always going to be there. And so therefore you can measure it, compensate for it, and reduce it in all subsequent images when you have the same settings. Dark current noise is noise that is introduced because of heat. What ends up happening is that as the temperature of the sensor heats up, the electrons start getting excited. And what happens is that those electrons get enough energy that they're able to cross into the pixel and actually stay lodged within the pixel's well, and therefore become representative of its charge. And so therefore, the hotter the sensor becomes, the more this noise accumulates, and the more you get noise within the image that you need to see. One of the ways that camera manufacturers reduce this is actually by cooling the sensor. So with CCDs, it was a lot easier to cool because they had this big surface underneath the sensor. You're able to put a cooler underneath, sometimes what they call a Peltier cooler, which is a thermoelectric cooler that actually was able to draw the heat out from the sensor using electromagnetic properties, and therefore bring the sensor down almost 30 degrees centigrade from ambient and cool that sensor down. Other techniques include water and just having simple air like a fan blowing over it to kind of minimize how much heat gets accumulated from the sensor, because the sensor is naturally going to want to generate heat because of all the things that are going on inside. It just naturally produces its own heat. The other style of noise is what they call temporal noise, which is noise that varies from time to time. And that could be just the fact that, the way in which the chip is designed, the noise floor goes up and down with all the things that are going on from all the data is being pushed through it, or the light itself has some variability to it. It's essentially noise that you cannot quantify, but if you take enough images, will eventually average out to a common value. And once you accumulate enough images, you can then use that common value to then subtract out of your subsequent images to minimize its effect on the overall image. And then, now that we've covered more of the analog styles of noise, then there's the digital noise. And this is noise that's introduced through the manipulation of the digitized data. There's a lot of algorithms and mathematics that get applied to that data as it's being pushed through the system for correction, for manipulation, and all that. And those mathematical errors that stay within the data become digital noise and produce artifacts on the image. Here are some of the things that you would see when it comes to artifacts in the image. So when you're shining your camera on a very bright area, in this case here I have these electronics that have this bright area. With the CCD more commonly, what ends up happening is that the light accumulates so much within that pixel well. If you can imagine, the pixel well is actually a bucket, and I'm pouring water in that bucket faster than I'm able to empty out the bucket. So what ends up happening is the bucket fills up, and eventually it spills over. Well, I have a bucket beside it for the next pixel, so when it spills over into the neighbor pixel, and so on and so forth. And then it gets filled up, and then it spills over. So you get this, what they call a blooming effect, as a result of these bright lights out of these intense areas within the image, saturating out a pixel and then spilling over into the neighboring pixels. CMOS has a much better methodology with dealing with blooming, and so therefore it's less susceptible to seeing this artifact. However, there is this one artifact that is less common now, but back in the day, if you shine a really bright light at a sensor, instead of it going bright white, it actually go pitch black, which was the counterintuitive. So you have this, what they call the black sun effect. And so you'd be looking at the sun, you'd have this halo of light, and all of a sudden you have this black center to it, which was a really weird effect. They've gotten a lot better with minimizing these effects. However, it's just something to be aware of if you're outside shooting and you see that your images are blooming like this. It's because you're getting too much light in. So now that we've talked about how the sensor accumulates the electrons and does it. Now we're going to talk about the different controls that the sensor provides. So there's a few controls that are fairly common with the sensors. There's what called the gain, which is often referred to in ISO, for those that are back in the days that used to have ISO film. So this gain is actually like an amplifier. It allows one to increase the overall intensity of the image. And it's typically a partially analog, partially digital, depending on the sensor. So most times you'll start off in the analog domain for the 5 to 10x style improvements or increases in intensity, and then as you get much higher than that, then it's more of a digital gain. It's basically a multiplication of the digital values by a specific value, and that increases the gain, but it's not as linear. It tends to create like holes within your histogram. It creates like a combing effect when you apply more of a digital gain versus an analog gain. The other thing that is used is what they call the color gains, the RGB gains. And this is how typical sensors will create a white balance. They'll use the color gains to increase and decrease the individual color channels to achieve a more white or a more color balance within the image. Typical sensors will, or I should say typical cameras actually, will use what they call a gray world algorithm. So they assume that on average, if you're looking at a scene, if I was to sum up all the individual color pixels, on average, those values should be fairly equal and therefore produce a grayish image. So the goal is to adjust the color gains so that those three values become very similar. They're not always perfect, but they're comfortably close. So that's how the cameras typically deal with white balance. The other thing that they have as well, which you probably don't see very often, is they control how quickly the sensor is read out. This is useful when you're trying to do more of that videography. So you want to be able to capture at a So it really dictates but in doing so, when you have a fast readout, you tend to introduce a little bit more read noise to it. So you have to be very cognizant of that. The other thing that it does is it also allows to control the actual area of the sensor that's being viewed. And oftentimes this is to accommodate the viewfinders. So when you're looking through your viewfinder, you're not looking at the entire array of the sensor, every single pixel. You're looking at a subset of those pixels. You see the entire field of view, but you don't see every single pixel in the array because that viewfinder doesn't have the same resolution as your sensor does. But it does provide something that gives you a good representation of the overall scene, and therefore you know how to be able to look through it and be able to see exactly what you want to see in your capture. So there's controls to define how and when you want to resize or reshape that image. Especially now with the newer digital still cameras, when you're running in still mode, so taking these single images, you're able to take the full field of view, which in some cases 42 megapixels. However, when you go into the video mode of it, well, then it's going to drop into a video format, so it's going to sub-window that image to go down to 1280 by 1024 or 1K by 2K or whatever resolution the video mode sets up. It'll then sub-window that sensor down to accommodate that and then provide that image. Another thing that these sensors often have as well too is what they call image stabilization. And all that really is that the image that's provided is a smaller subset of the overall field of view. And in order to accommodate the stabilization, what they do is they just kind of move around the sensor area to counterbalance the shaking that's happening. So what you're seeing is always in the center, but it's actually moving on the sensor, and the sensor is trying to accommodate so that what you're seeing is always in the same spot relative to the image you're actually seeing. So what's the real difference between taking a video and taking a still image? Well, typically when it comes to video, you have a fairly common size field of view, whether it's 640 by 480, full HD, which is 1900 by 1080, 4K or even 8K resolutions, and they're pretty typical. They often have a hard and fast frame rate. Usually it's 60 frames per second, or even 120 frames per second, or even faster than that. So they're very dictated to that. The frames themselves will start and are triggered asynchronously, meaning they're not synchronized to any external event in any way. They just happen one after another based on the exposure and the timing of how the sensor is set up. All the images are typically stored into one file, and they do these different techniques to compress and minimize how big the file is. But we're able to have it so that the images are in that one file, and they're able to have multiple frames within it. And it's often what is used for the viewfinders for a lot of the mirrorless DSLRs. When it comes to the still images, the resolution can be set to a much larger field of view. You're able to dictate a lot more of the controls, like the exposure and the bursting rates. The image is often synchronized to a trigger event. Usually it's the button on the top. There's only one image in a file, and it takes a lot more time to process that image, because what happens is it takes the image and applies all of the algorithms to improve the quality, and it's all done typically on board the camera. So hopefully you can still hear me. I know I've been losing my internet connection. Hopefully it's coming back. I don't see anybody else complaining, but I'll keep going. So when it comes to color, there are different ways of addressing it. So we talked about the black level, the noise, and the image stabilization and all that. But there's also this thing called demosaicing, and I'm going to go into that a little bit later. And that's the process in which you get the color information out of the camera, out of the sensor, and you're able to artificially provide the color for the areas that are missing. And then you have these color filters that are applied as well that compensate for the various different lighting conditions and the fact that the sensor doesn't quite see color the same way as it sees it from the human eye. And then I talked about the blooming and smearing and all that as well. So there are other different things that will affect the quality of the sensor. So how do you create color from this Bayer pattern that we talked about? So as I mentioned, the Bayer pattern has rows of greens and reds and reds and blues. Sorry, greens and blues. And they're ordered in this typical style. So if I wanted to find for this position the three color values for it, well, I already know what the red value is, but I need to determine the green and the blue. So in this particular case, they use a weighted average. So they look at the nearest neighbors and from that determine what the value should be in that location. So in this particular case, if I'm looking at the red pixel, I actually go 2 pixels up in either direction and mathematically accumulate the values based on this algorithm. So I weight the middle pixel with a value of 4, I weight the green pixels with a value of 2, and then I subtract the outer regions to compensate. So the overall value I get is still a value that doesn't have any additional gain applied to it, but does give me the correct value for those locations. So in this particular case, I'm able to figure out what the green pixels are and figure out what the blue pixels are. So when I'm looking at areas where, it's a little further away, well, then I start looking at the corner pixels and I start reading what those corner pixels would be in order to get it. So if this was my blue pixel here, I need to get all these green pixels to figure out what the green value would be here. and then I look at the nearest neighbor reds to figure out what those red values would be. So as you can see, as you start going through the sensor, it becomes a little bit more challenging to get accurate color. So you have to start compensating for that color using other methods. And so the interpolation method you use is very important. Some will emphasize that you get the best color while sacrificing potentially the sharpness of the image, because to get the best color, I look at more of the, I look at a wider circle of color, but in doing so, I lose those fine edges. Or I sacrifice the quality of the color to maintain those sharp edges and only look at the really closest neighbors to those pixels. One of the ways in which color is improved upon is through what they call a color correction matrix. And essentially, that's just a 3x3 matrix that is applied to the color data that helps improve its response depending on the lighting conditions. So when you think of light, you often think of it, well, it's a full spectrum of light. But we all know that when we go into a light that has an incandescent light and I have something of color, it will look different if I went to something that's fluorescent or maybe even something that has LED lighting. And that's because the light spectrum of those lights is not equal across the entire spectrum of light. So when I look at the sun, I get a full nice spectrum from blue to red that's fairly even throughout. However, when I look at all these other artificial lights, it is not equal. Incandescent is heavily dominated in the red. Fluorescent has these weird spikes in the middle of it. Same thing with the compact fluorescent. And then LED is a little bit more uniform, but again has this humongous spike in the blue range, which throws off how the color response of the camera and how it sees color. So typically what camera manufacturers will do, they'll look at this thing called a Macbeth chart. This is what it looks like. And they'll shine light in a certain environment onto this chart and have the camera read that information and adjust the color response of the camera using these correction matrices to try to get these colors to be perfect all the way across. So if you're looking at a Macbeth chart, typically what you see is the second last row is your primary colors, so your red, green, blue, yellow, cyan, and magenta, or magenta, cyan. And then you have the intensity values at the bottom, so from bright white to black dark, and then these are common colors in nature. So these two are your skin tones, some of these are leaf colors, some of these are flowers, and they're calibrated. They're specifically defined so that this chart, if I pull one chart out here and I bring it into some other area, somebody else's chart, it will look identical. So this is why they use these charts. They're very expensive, like several $100s for a standard sheet of paper, but very powerful when it comes to ensuring the quality of the color being produced by the camera. So what they do is that they create individual matrices for this. And this is similar to what you see in your digital still camera when they talk about, like, are you shooting under cloudy light versus daylight? Are you shooting under fluorescent light? It's essentially defining which matrix they're going to use to process the image to apply the color so that you get a better, truer color response and it matches to what you think you're seeing in that environment.
Darren?
Yep.
So you're going to talk later about JPEG versus RAW and whatnot, but when you say the camera set for daylight versus fluorescent, the camera will process it differently. My understanding is the camera can process it differently if you ask for a JPEG output, but is any of this happening in RAW?
No. What will happen in RAW is it'll actually put in to the metadata of that file what should have been set by the camera, so that when it's doing a preview, it'll apply the appropriate settings for that style of light, but it won't actually apply it to the data that's inside that raw file.
Okay.
Yep. One of the things that is happens with cameras is what they call this moire pattern. And essentially, it's an artifact of the fact that the pixels themselves have spaces between them. And it's the interference pattern that it happens from the fact that you have a repeating pattern that does not align nicely to the pattern of the pixels on the sensor. And this becomes a lot more predominant when you're looking at a color image with a color sensor, because the color information is much more separated within each other. So then you get a lot more of these artificial color artifacts onto the image that get introduced from the demosaicing that's being done on the pixels. So that's why when you're looking at a black and white image and you have a lot of interference on it, so high intensity shifts, so between a bright and a dark area, you actually start seeing color and not just grays. And that's because of that demosaicing that's happening on your camera. So some of the things that happen, whether it's within the camera, slightly outside the camera, or actually in a tool like Photoshop, is a lot of processing that's happening. Within the camera itself, there's oftentimes you're going to have some form of pixel correction or blob correction or line correction. And this is just to compensate for some of the artifacts that get introduced in the camera. The sensor themselves, though they may be pristine when they came out of the factory, they're actually susceptible to cosmic rays. So if you have the off chance that a cosmic ray happens to get into your sensor, it could actually damage a pixel, and now you have a defective pixel. So what happens is there's actually a table within the camera usually that will mark that pixel as being defective, and then look at the nearest neighbors and come up with a reasonable approximation of what that value should be. And that's one typical way of doing some of that type of processing. In other cases, you could have manufacturing defects that allow a pixel to not react as brightly as it should. And so therefore it'll be marked as a defective pixel, or there could be a whole line or a whole area that could have this artifact, and at which point you need to have special mechanisms to correct for that. Other things that happen as well as image enhancements. So they'll do like hue and saturation compensations within it. They'll even do, they'll use basically that 3x3 matrix. They'll use lookup tables to apply other things like gamma, contrast, and brightness. They'll even have convolution filters to help sharpen or blur or do other filtering within the camera, and sometimes they'll do it externally as well. And they'll do another thing either by call flat field correction or similar to dark frame subtraction, whereby they'll take an image of a blank scene and use that as a method to correct and compensate for things. So if you had a non-uniform light, or your lens is projecting non-uniformly, you can actually take an image of a blank field, get that curve of the non-uniformity, and then subtract that or add that to the images to overcome those effects in subsequent images. Now, when we talk about the file formats and the compression, there are two primary methods for compression. There's what they call lossless and lossy. Lossless is a compression whereby you are able to reduce the size of the data being stored without losing the information. This compression is usually the one you want to use more frequently because you don't lose any information. However, you cannot get a very big compression ratio. Typically, it's about a 2-to-1. As a result, many people often go with more of a lossy compression, which allows for a little bit of the data to be destroyed, but gives you the benefit of having smaller file sizes, which can be beneficial if you're stretched for storage space. And this is typically what's used in like JPEG imaging, which is why oftentimes they tell you to not use JPEG and use RAW, because you don't get those artifacts that are caused due to the compression. JPEG compression is very common and very noticeable because you'll see it as actually a compression that works on an 8x8 matrix. So you'll see these 8x8 squares, and you'll see these hard edges where that compression is when you zoom into the image. When we talk about raw file formats, every camera manufacturer has their own style of storing that information, but essentially they all fall in a similar pattern which I've defined here. So if you look at your file on, let's say, your Windows or your Mac machine, if you were to go into the bits and bytes of it, what you'd see at the beginning is a file header that basically defines what the file is. It basically says, yeah, I'm an image file, and this is a location where my information starts. It then goes into a different section, which we have is what we call a sensor metadata section. So this is the area that's defined by the manufacturer, where they store all that lovely information about the image, the ISO, the exposure time, the various different settings. They'll store in the correction matrix, as I said, that's being applied. It'll talk about the location, and all that other data that is stored by the camera manufacturer will be put into the sensor manufacturer metadata. And then in the image metadata, depending on the manufacturer, they'll either have it in the sensor manufacturer's metadata or in the image data, but that's also stored like the same thing. So the gains, and that's more specific to the image itself. They'll store it in this section. It's usually predefined based on the file type that's being used. And then they'll store a thumbnail view of the image. So this is that image that's used so that when you're looking at the browser, your Windows browser, your file browser, when you see that preview of what the image looks like, that's what it takes, is that thumbnail view, and uses that as its icon. And then it stores the image. It gives a full size, in some cases, the full image is stored in a TIFF file format, which is a compressed file format, but it's a compression that doesn't lose a lot of data. There is still a bit of data that's lost, but not a lot. And that gets compressed at the end part of the image. And it's a predefined format, and it'll ask you to fit it all in. So I see a question came in. Is it true that Sony RAW formats have some lossy compression? They do and they don't. Because they're using a TIFF format, there is the potential for some loss. But in my experience, it's so unnoticeable that it's not as bad as using a JPEG at all. It's equivalent to, it would be the same loss that you would see both with a Canon or even a Nikon RAW format. So, yeah. And that's it for my presentation. I hope it was informative. I hope I didn't, it was matched to what people wanted to hear. And now I'm open for any conversations or questions you may have. Feel free to ask away, and I'd be happy to try to answer the best I can.
Well, thank you very much. I find it interesting to listen to how much is really going on from the time the photons hit that sensor, because in my mind, a raw image was completely unprocessed. It was like virgin, no processing or manipulation, and now it's kind of like, no, wait a minute. A lot of manufacturing decisions went into what I get as raw, and if they'd manufactured it or did it a little differently, then there would have been a little bit more emphasis on maybe the sharpness and not the color accuracy or whatever. So I thought it was always the same. It does leave me to ask questions like the Nikon has something called dynamic range or something like that I can turn on, and it's not a JPEG thing, it's a raw thing, and it makes the dark's not as dark and the bright's not as bright, and it compresses the dynamic range. And I'm going, is that some sort of electronic algorithm or bias that's happening while capturing the raw, or is it in fact nothing to do with that at all? And it's just proprietary, right? You don't know what these guys are doing.
Exactly, and it could be just the fact that the way they're digitizing, they may be just digitizing, putting more bits to the middle range, so you get a lot more emphasis in that middle range, so you get a lot more detail, and de-emphasizing the brighter and the dark areas because there's usually less information there.
Yeah.
So they could be doing something like that, and it could be done at the pixel level, where they're modifying. If you have, let's say it's a voltage, it goes from 0 to 100. Instead of it being 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe you have to go 1, 2, 3 before it moves to the next value, and then it slowly reduces, and eventually you get finer granularity in the middle, and then it gets really high granularity at the top.
Yeah.
So it could be something like that they're just faking the way in which they're doing it in either the analog domain or the digital domain.
Yeah, but they don't tell you.
No. And I know a lot of secrets because I deal with Sony, but even they are very secretive of some of the things they do. So I also have to be careful when I do these types of presentations that I don't expose some of their trade secrets. I think I was very careful with that, but yeah, there is still a lot of smarts that they put in. There's several tens of man years put into the algorithms and the processes to improve the quality of these cameras.
Yeah, well, and you can see from your discussion why, like a camera manufactured 5 years ago, it has a completely different sensor setup and noise reduction and all that kind of stuff. It's constantly evolving. So.
Yeah, I see a question came in. The question is, many camera makers use Sony sensors. Is the sensor good reason to choose a Sony camera over another maker using a Sony sensor? That's a very loaded question. And I say that because, yes, Sony knows how to build a camera and Sony knows the sensor itself. They probably have some inside talking. But at the same time, there's a lot of manufacturers out there that are not biased by that and have produced even better quality than in some cases what Sony does. So again, it's one of those things you have to really take it out in the field, try it yourself, and see if it's if you see the difference. Because there are some manufacturers, even though they're not Sony, that are using a Sony sensor that do provide a better response than what Sony does within their own cameras.
So if somebody uses a Sony sensor, do they alter any of the electronics or algorithms? Is it like they just, or do they, get it all pre-made?
It's basically the sensor itself. What you get off the sensor is going to be the same regardless of what it is, but it's how you treat that data once it comes off. So how you set up your correction matrix, possibly even some of the electronics. You can influence how the image is digitized, from the speed or whatever, reducing the amount of noise that gets introduced throughout the entire process could have a better impact. The type of glass you put in front of it. So typically these cameras will have what they call a near IR cut filter put in front of it to block out that near IR light. Where that filter cuts off and how well that filter cuts off will dictate the performance of the camera. So each manufacturer will have a different process in which they do it, and therefore could influence the quality of the images they produce.
Interesting. Well, it's clear that the sensor is very fixed because of the way you described it. I had a vision of putting an FX lens for a DX lens on my camera, and I would get a different resolution. I'm going, oh, okay, they just broke up the sensor into more pixels or less pixels, and they're just bigger pixels. But no, I guess as you said, they what did you call it? Sub
window.
They window.
Sub window and subsample. Yeah.
So they're really only using a piece of the sensor. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's why it's also important to match the lens to the sensor size, because the projection of the light that comes out of that lens, you want to make sure it's covering the sweet spot of the sensor, and that sweet spot of the lens, you want that to align to where the sensor is. So if your lens is projecting not properly on its circle's not properly on the square, you'll get what they call vignetting on the edges, where you see a gradient, like a darker area around the edge. So you want to make sure you're matching that properly with the lens you're using.
Yeah.
And I see some other questions that are coming in. So One of the questions is, where is the money being spent now? Is it the sensor technology or the processing? I look in the regards to smartphone cameras and how good they are becoming in some ways and equally to some of those digital still results. It's funny because when I brought up this topic with Mike, one of the things we were thinking about is talking about, what's the difference between a DSLR and a cell phone camera, and do I need to get a DSLR now? So I might still do that one and kind of explain that. But the short answer is it's actually in both. A lot of these sensor manufacturers are putting a lot of effort in creating better pixels, more high-performing pixels. In the case of Sony, what they're doing is, especially with this backside illuminated technology, they're actually creating these pixels that can see so well in the dark that they're actually called moonlight style sensors. They're actually able to see really well with no external light other than simply the moon lit. So they're able to see really deeply in the dark light. So there's a lot of effort in miniaturizing those pixels, being able to put more pixels in the same area and getting a better response, deeper wells, so they're able to have more electrons, which allows for better granularity, better dynamic range for these pixels in these images. But there's also a lot of work being put in on the processing side as well, especially on the cell phones, because cell phones is a combination. They're trying to get small sensors because they don't want to carry this big thing, but they also put a lot of effort in processing to improve the quality. They're really targeting those portrait-style images because everyone's doing TikTok and all these things, and they want to get those really nice images and put these massive filters on it to create these puppy dog faces and all these artificial filters to the point where it's becoming almost able to create deep fakes within your camera with the technology they're running now. Another question that came in, does it matter what raw converter to use when processing images? For example, is DxO a better choice than Camera Raw or Lightroom or other programs? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. It really depends on the application. Many of them will actually have a proper filter for the RAW of that particular camera. So you just want to make sure that when you're in these applications, you're doing the raw conversion, that you select the right raw converter for your camera so that it applies the proper color correction matrices and all these other fine things that are difficult to reproduce accurately unless you have the specifics from the manufacturer themselves. Can you see a blown pixel when pixel peeping? In theory, yes, but you have to have a trained eye. Typically, what will happen is that if the algorithm has done its job correctly, it will have already masked that pixel and will provide that data and will have done something to make it look similar. So when you get into when you zoom in really deeply and you start looking at edges and stuff like that, all of a sudden you'll see like a jagged line or something to that effect. Then you may see where a pixel may have been corrected. But again, you have to know what you're looking for. It's not easy to find.
Speaking of blown pixels, a lot of the cameras will show you blown out pixels, and my understanding is the camera is actually responding to the JPEG. So sometimes if you see just minor areas that are blown out, when you get to the RAW, in fact, you're still okay. So the camera is actually looking at the JPEG when it's telling you what's blown out or what's completely black.
I don't know exactly how that works. I can only hypothesize, but likelihood is that it could just be the bit depth. So JPEGs are usually an 8-bit depth versus your RAW, which could be at a deeper bit depth, whether it's 10, 12, 14, or even 16 bits. So when it goes into those larger bit depths, they're looking at the upper echelon of the image, and that's usually what creates the JPEG. So if the JPEG's blowing out, then it means you're getting close to that upper echelon in the bigger bit depths, and therefore you want to make sure you compensate and don't blow it out too much.
Yeah.
But so that's why sometimes you may see those slight differences between the two.
Okay. I know like a bride wearing a sequin dress, that you might get, blown out pixels on each of the sequins, but when you process the picture, in fact, the detail's still there. So
Yeah.
one of those little
And
details.
again, it depends on how much bit depth you have. So if you can push down into like basically bring your data down in the system, then you may still get that data in the upper areas.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, certainly a lot of technology behind the scenes that we don't know about. We just kind of just point and shoot, literally.
Yeah.
All this magic's happening behind the scenes, and we don't even know what's happening. So,
Exactly.
so some really good stuff. So we've hit our 9:30. I don't see a lot of more questions here. So I'll
If anybody
just,
wants,
oh,
if anybody wants to turn their mic and ask a question, feel free to
yeah,
as well.
yeah, I'll give people a chance to do that. So as we wait to see if anybody turns their mic on, I want to thank you for taking all the time to present and prepare all of this for us. And let's see if I get any calls or suggestions about this camera phone thing. I know most of the people in the group are serious photographers, whatever that means, and are probably working with cameras. But I've had a few people who are really interested in using the camera phone a lot more, because it is impressive what they can do these days.
It is.
Okay, I think Roman's just turned on his mic. Darren,
Yes.
go ahead, Roman.
Yes, thank you. I was not there at the beginning, but I'm not sure if you talk about how to clean the sensor, because
Yeah, we didn't. I didn't actually touch on that part, but we did talk about it. Ironically, it wasn't part of my presentation. Somebody had brought it up, and Mike had mentioned a few things. I don't typically clean the inside of a DLSR. I've cleaned a lot of stuff where I had full access to the sensor. So some of the techniques that I use in that case is high percentage alcohol, typically an isopropyl alcohol, 99.96, whatever that number is the best, because you want something that you can still basically get the grime off, but dries really quickly and doesn't leave any residue behind. So what we used to do in the past is we have some linen or even a Q-tip that was lint-free, special Q-tips, and we dip that in this alcohol and then just rub it across the sensor really quickly and allow it to evaporate and dry without leaving that residue. And that got rid of 90% of the issues we needed to deal with. But with typical DLSRs, it's usually just dust that falls in, and so oftentimes just a little bit of a push of air, a puff of air will help. One technique that I use a lot is when I'm putting on and off my lens, I try to keep my camera upside down and put my lens in, so that if there is any dirt and debris, it'll tend to fall out naturally with gravity as I'm putting it in and taking it off. So instead of trying to do it this way where it could stay inside, I just make that habit. So it's not always going to work, because obviously if there's some debris that's there, it's going to get caught inside. But if you can keep that habit, it helps minimize how much dirt gets inside.
Okay, thank you very much.
Aaron, Eden Bromfield here.
Yes.
I frequently hear on the internet that there seems to be a relationship between sensor size and depth of field. To me, that doesn't make any sense to me. In other words, they're saying if you've got a micro four thirds sensor and you use a lens, let's say f2, then that would be the equivalent of a f4 lens on a 35mm sensor. That to me is a property of the lens, nothing to do with the sensor. Could you clarify that for me, please?
Yes, it is. So basically, it all depends on the lens itself. So if you have a lens that's properly matched to the sensor size, then there is no difference. There's no equivalency. They're equal. So the challenge, though, is that many of the lenses are defined for a specific sensor size. And what ends up happening is that you put a sensor size that's different from that lens. And therefore, just the whole mathematical relationship, the triangle of focus that comes in and out of that lens will vary. So if you can imagine, there's a circle that the lens projects out of. If your sensor goes to the edges of the circle, then you're seeing more of what the lens can provide. But if you're only using a portion of that, a very small portion, well, you need to have an equivalent lens that's only seeing that little bit. So you're only using a sliver of what your lens is if your sensor's smaller than what your lens actually projects. So the goal is always to try to get lenses that more closely match the size of the sensor. So they don't do that as much with DSLRs, but the lenses I use on industrial lines, they'll often have the output pupil, and they'll say that it is targeted to this size of sensor. And therefore, when it projects, the sweet spot hits that sensor nicely, given its optical format, and therefore there's no differences. It's when you start putting things that are a different size behind that lens, and the lens is not matched, and that's when you have that effect.
So that's affecting the depth of field?
Yes, because essentially what it is when you go smaller, it's almost like you've closed up your aperture because you're only using the small portion of the actual lens. So because you closed up your aperture, your depth of field changes, similar to like if you were closing up your aperture, because you're not using the full array of the lens itself.
That's an artifact basically of the sensor size and lens matching, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because like I said, if you use the full part of the lens, then you have less of that. But because you're only using a small portion of it, you're almost like squinting through the lens because you're only seeing a little bit of it.
If you had the situation where you had the micro 4/3 sensor and a 35mm sensor, and you've got a lens that covers the sweet spot in both, would there be any difference then?
There will be some difference because it's going to be accommodating for the larger sensor, the 35mm. But it depends if the electronics of the lens is able to detect that it's connecting to a 4/3 inch and accommodate accordingly. Most of them don't do that. I think there are a few that are able to detect that this is a 4/3 inch lens, and when you set a certain value, it'll actually compensate whether it's a 35mm or if it's a 4/3.
Thank you.
One question, Darren.
Yep.
Color profiles in matching monitors, cameras, printers. It seems like a black art in a way for me. And with all the digitization, one would think there would be standardization and ways of accommodating across a broad range of devices and stuff like that. Is it an issue or I don't know.
It's all in relation to several different factors. So each sensor has its own color response that needs to be matched so it's projected properly on the screen. The actual screen itself decays over time, so it needs more intensity in order to achieve the same dynamic range. So therefore, you need to match that. And then the printer has its color responses based on its tonality, and you have to match that. So it is very much a black art, unfortunately, to match everything through the entire chain. And I've done it a few times, and it's been very painful to do. To try to get the color response equal across the board. Typically, what I try to do is take one of the equation. So usually, if I'm going to a print media, I won't worry about what I see on the screen. I'll just use the screen as a reference to say that, well, when I see this color on the screen, it's not bright enough on my printer, so I need to adjust this to get that color response correctly on my printer, even though what I see on my screen may not match what I'm actually printing on my printer. Just because there's just too many things to try to balance between the two. But if you're one who actually needs to work in a Photoshop environment where you need to have that monitor, then you need to worry about that as well. So it's really tough. Like I said, I've done it. I'm not an expert at it. It's not easy to do.
Is it a matter of standardization by manufacturers and that, or is it a technology type issue?
It's a bit of both. The manufacturers themselves, the way in which they design the products aren't always consistent. So even a Sony sensor that is relatively consistent could have some slight color differences depending on the thickness of the color masks and how the pixels themselves react to color. So you have to tweak the mask specifically for that camera and then do the same thing for the monitor you're working on. Even though the monitor may be standardized, its physical response could have some slight variabilities from monitor to monitor. So unless you're willing to pay a lot of money to get them properly calibrated and uniform, you're typically sacrificing your time and trying to tweak those devices to get them to match yourself.
Okay. Thanks very much.
I think some of the standardization you'd need to do, Dave, also includes the viewing environment. So you'd have to standardize your living room and the light.
Well, I know, yeah. It's everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So well, I say that because I do a lot of the art side in digital manipulation.
Okay.
Throws it in.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, well, let's bring this to a close. Once again, Darren, thank you very much. I'm seeing lots of good comments from everybody in terms of thanks for the presentations and well organization. And
thank you.
Let's see if we can get you out to some of these events and meet you in person.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I'd love to sit down with everyone and learn more about, like I said, the creative side of things, how to use the Photoshops, and how to get more out of my images. I'll teach you guys as much as you want about the technology. Thank you.